Someone had torn his wrists open, not with a knife, not with fire, with rope, or something like rope, pulled tight for too long, long enough to leave a scar that circled the entire wrist like a bracelet he never chose to wear. Sabrina Voss noticed that before she noticed anything else about the man in room 4, before the file that was too thin to be real, before the name with no family attached, no emergency contact, no one who'd call and ask how he was doing. Before she knew he hadn't said a word in 6 days, and that at Blue Ridge Community Clinic, she was the only one who thought that was strange. He'd arrived on a Tuesday night, brought in by a county van after a 2-hour drive from a bigger hospital, with a folder so empty it looked like a clerical error. Name, Daniel Cole. Diagnosis, bilateral lower limb paralysis, incomplete spinal cord injury, T10 level. Cause of injury, blank. Someone had typed unknown trauma, reported industrial accident, and stopped there, as if the phrase settled anything. Sabrina had been a nurse for 4 months. She still double-checked charts, still introduced herself by her full name instead of just your nurse today, still felt a small flicker of pride every time she got a blood draw right on the first try. The other nurses at Blue Ridge, Carla, 19 years in, and Big Tom, who ran the night shift like a drill sergeant, had already sized up room 4 and moved on. Probably a vet, they figured. VA paperwork was a nightmare, insurance was worse, and the man barely looked at anyone who walked in. He answered questions with a single word, if he answered at all. He was, in the shorthand, nobody says out loud, but everyone understands. Not a priority. Sabrina disagreed, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Maybe it was the way his eyes moved, not blank, not defeated, but scanning, cataloging the room, the exits, the sound of the hallway. Maybe it was his hands, calloused in a way that didn't match industrial accident. "Mr. Cole," she said on her first shift with him, adjusting his IV line. "I'm going to check your vitals now, is that all right?" He nodded. That was the whole conversation. The mountains around Blue Ridge were the kind of green that swallows sound. The clinic itself was a squat brick building that had been a schoolhouse decades earlier, converted when the county couldn't afford a real hospital, and the nearest trauma center sat 90 minutes away down switchback roads. It served coal families, dairy families, a handful of retirees who'd bought cheap land, and a few veterans who came home broken in ways the mountains understood better than any city did. Nobody asked too many questions here. Usually that was a mercy. For Daniel Cole, it was starting to feel like something else. By the second week, Sabrina had learned the shape of his silence. He ate what was put in front of him, did his physical therapy without complaint, and spent hours staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight, his hands sometimes clenched around the bed sheet, like a man holding onto a ledge only he could see. He never asked about his prognosis, never asked when he could leave, as if some part of him had already decided the answer didn't matter. It was on a Thursday night, during a rare double shift, that Sabrina heard him talking. She'd gone in around 2 a.m. to change his fluid bag, moving quietly so as not to wake him, and found him already deep in a restless sleep, sweat beading at his hairline despite the cool room. His lips were moving. At first she assumed it was the usual static everyone produces in dreams. Then she caught a whole fragment. "Hold the perimeter. Ramos, hold the..." His voice cracked, low and urgent, nothing like the flat tone he used awake. "Get him out! Get him out! That's an order!" Sabrina froze by the IV pole, her hand still on the bag. "Villegas is down. I need eyes on the compound. I need..." His whole body tensed, his back arching slightly off the mattress, a man straining against restraints that weren't there. "No." "Negative. Hold position, hold." He woke with a gasp sharp enough to fill the room, his eyes snapping open, unfocused for a full 3 seconds before they found her. "Sorry," she said quickly, hands raised, the way you'd approach something wounded and unpredictable. "You were dreaming. I was just changing your fluids." His breathing slowed, but his eyes didn't leave her. There was something in them now, not embarrassment, not the usual sheepishness of someone caught talking in their sleep. Calculation. He was measuring how much she'd heard, and whether it mattered. "What did I say?" His voice came out rough. "Names. Something about a perimeter." She kept her tone light, ordinary, the voice she used for patients who needed to feel like nothing unusual was happening. "Bad dream." He looked at her for a long moment, then turned his face toward the window, toward the black shape of the mountains against a blacker sky. Yeah, he said. Bad dream. She didn't push. She'd already learned in those 4 months that you don't force a locked door. You leave it unlocked and step back, and sometimes the person on the other side decides to open it themselves. She finished the fluid bag, checked his vitals, wrote her notes, and left him to the dark. But she thought about it the whole drive home. The way the name Ramos had come out of him like something torn loose. The way Villegas is down hadn't sounded like a dream at all. It had sounded like a memory with the serial numbers filed off. She thought about the scars on his wrists, about the way his eyes catalogued rooms, about how a man who'd supposedly lost the use of his legs in an industrial accident moved the rest of his body with the coiled discipline of someone who had spent years being trained, not injured, trained, into stillness. Sabrina didn't know who Daniel Cole was, but she was starting to understand that whoever he'd been before Blue Ridge, before the wheelchair, before the silence, that man hadn't disappeared. He was still in there, standing guard over something he wasn't ready to let anyone see. She decided, driving those dark mountain roads home, that she wasn't going anywhere. 3 weeks in, Daniel Cole had a routine, and Sabrina had made herself part of it without either of them agreeing to it out loud. She started requesting his room on her rounds, started staying a few extra minutes after his physical therapy, officially to check the surgical site, actually just to sit with him while he caught his breath, his shirt soaked through, his arm shaking on the parallel bars he was learning to use in place of legs that no longer answered him. He never asked her to stay. He never asked her to leave either. For a man like him, that was already its own kind of invitation. "You're not from around here," he said one afternoon, out of nowhere, while she checked the dressing on his lower back. "Columbus, Ohio," she said. "Took the first nursing job that would take a new grad without 3 years of ICU experience. Turned out that was rural Virginia. Long way from home. Not as long as some people's, I'd guess. It was the closest she'd come to prying, and she watched him go still the way he always did when a conversation got near the edge of something. But instead of shutting down, he said quietly, "No, not as long as some." It wasn't much, but it was a door left open half an inch, and Sabrina had learned to notice those. The PTSD, when it showed itself, didn't look like the movies. It wasn't dramatic flashbacks or screaming. It was smaller, and in its way worse. A food cart rattling past his door that made him go rigid for 4 full seconds before he remembered where he was. A thunderstorm one evening that had him gripping the wheelchair armrests hard enough to whiten his knuckles, his breathing gone shallow and controlled in a way that looked less like fear and more like a man running a drill he'd rehearsed 100 times. Survive the next 60 seconds, then the 60 after that. She found him once at 4 a.m., unable to sleep, sitting up with the lights off, staring at nothing. She didn't turn the lights on. She just pulled a chair over and sat. "You don't have to talk," she said. "I just don't like the idea of you doing this alone at 4 in the morning." He didn't answer for a long time. Then, there were 4 of us who didn't come back the same. 2 didn't come back at all. His voice was flat, careful. A man testing weight on a bridge he didn't trust. "I used to run 6 miles before breakfast. Used to carry 180 pounds of gear up a mountain without thinking twice." A short, humorless breath. "Now I think about whether I can get from this bed to that bathroom without falling on my face." "That's not weakness," Sabrina said. "That's a different mountain." He looked at her then, really looked, like the sentence had landed somewhere he hadn't expected. "You don't know anything about my mountains," he said, but there was no bite in it, just exhaustion. "No," she agreed, "but I know you're still climbing one, even at 4 in the morning, even when nobody's watching." He didn't answer that, but the next night, when the storm came back, he let her sit through it with him instead of gripping the armrests alone. For a man who'd spent his whole career being the one who held things together for everyone else, that was its own quiet surrender. It was Carla who first said the word out loud. "You know he was Special Forces, right?" she said one evening in the break room, stirring coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. "Or is. I did a rotation at Walter Reed years back. You learn to spot it. The way they carry stillness in their body. The way they never sit with their back to a door." Sabrina had noticed exactly that. Daniel always angled his wheelchair to face the doorway every single time, without seeming to think about it. "He's never said anything," Sabrina said. "They don't." Carla shrugged. Whatever happened to him is probably still classified, or close enough that admitting the truth would open doors he doesn't want opened. An injury like his doesn't usually come with industrial accident written on the chart. That's the phrase people use when the real answer is somebody else's problem to bury. Sabrina thought about Ramos, about Villegas is down, about a man who tensed at the sound of a food cart and gripped his armrests through thunderstorms like they were incoming fire, and who could still, in the half-light of 4 a.m., find the exact words to tell a stranger that her comfort had landed somewhere true. She started to understand that whatever Daniel Cole had survived wasn't over. It had just changed shape, from bullets and mountains on the other side of the world to a hospital bed in Virginia, from a team that had his back to a nurse 4 months out of school who had decided, without asking anyone's permission, that she wasn't going to let him fight this one alone either. The next time the storm rolled in, she didn't wait to be found awake. She went in before the rain even started, pulled up her chair and said, "Tell me about Ramos if you want to, or don't. I'll sit here either way." For the first time since he'd arrived, Daniel Cole almost smiled. "You're persistent," he said. "I'm from Ohio," she said. "It's all we've got." And this time, when the thunder rolled in over the mountains, he started haltingly to talk. The story came out over many nights, not one. The way ice breaks up on a river, not all at once but in cracks that widen slowly until the whole surface gives. Daniel had spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL. The mission that ended his career had a name he wouldn't say and a location he wouldn't name, only that it had gone wrong the way missions go wrong when the intelligence is bad and the exit isn't where it's supposed to be. Ramos had been 26. Villegas had a daughter he never met, born 3 weeks after he died. Daniel took shrapnel across his lower spine, dragging Villegas's body toward the extraction point, past the point where dragging still made a difference, because some decisions get made by the body before the mind signs off on them. "None of that went on paper," he told her one night, his voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "Officially, it doesn't exist. Officially, I hurt my back in a training accident and got a medical discharge and a folder full of forms designed to make sure nobody ever asks a follow-up question." He looked down at his hands. "I've spent 4 months being nobody. Turns out nobody doesn't get very good health care." "You're not nobody," Sabrina said. "I know that now." He glanced at her, and there was something new in his face. Not quite ease, but the early framework of it. Didn't for a while. She didn't tell him she'd already guessed most of it. From a name muttered in his sleep, a ring of scars, and the particular stillness of a man who always faced the door. It didn't feel like the moment for that. It felt like a moment for listening. So she listened, and somewhere in the listening, whatever was between them had quietly become more than nurse and patient, though neither of them said so, and neither of them rushed to. It was Carla, this time with purpose instead of gossip, who made the calls that got things moving. A friend of a friend at the VA, a caseworker who actually returned phone calls, a rehabilitation program 2 hours away in Roanoke that specialized in combat-related paraplegia, and happened to have an opening for a new patient with a complicated, half-buried service record. It took another 6 weeks of paperwork and appeals, plus one very tense phone call from a man who identified himself only as someone Daniel used to work with, who, after confirming a few facts, made an entire wall of red tape disappear overnight. The morning Daniel left Blue Ridge, the sun was doing something rare for the mountains in late autumn, burning gold through a low mist, clinging to the ridgelines like it didn't want to let go of the night. Sabrina walked him out to the van herself, off the clock, because some goodbyes you don't want a co-worker cataloging. "Roanoke's not that far," he said, parked at the base of the ramp, looking up at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something almost bashful, almost hopeful, sitting strange and unexpected on a face built for guarding secrets. 2 hours, she agreed. "I know the drive. You planning on making it?" "I'm planning on making it," she said, "if you're planning on still being someone worth the gas money." He laughed, actually laughed, a short, surprised bark of a sound she realized she'd never once heard from him in 9 weeks. And it was, she thought, one of the best sounds she'd heard in a long time. "For what it's worth," he said, quieter now. "You were the first person in this whole mess who looked at me like I was still someone. Not a chart, not a case number, not an industrial accident." He shook his head. "You have no idea what that's worth to a guy like me." "I think I've got a decent idea," she said. "You talk in your sleep, remember?" Something crossed his face. Not quite alarm, more like rueful recognition. The look of a man realizing a door he thought he'd kept locked had been open the whole time, and that the person who walked through it had chosen, every single day since, to stay. "How much do you know?" he asked. "Enough to know you're not nobody," she said, "and enough to know I'm not in a hurry to find out the rest. You'll tell me when you're ready. You've gotten pretty good at that lately." The van driver called that they were ready to load. Daniel wheeled himself up the ramp, then paused at the top and looked back down at her, framed by gold mist and mountains that had, in their quiet and indifferent way, carried both of them through the worst of it. 2 hours, he said again, and this time it sounded less like a distance and more like a promise. "I'll bring coffee," she said. "Ohio doesn't do decaf." He was still smiling as the doors closed. Sabrina stood in the parking lot long after the van had disappeared around the bend, the mountains rising green and endless on every side, thinking about the man who'd arrived 9 weeks earlier as an unmarked folder and a locked door, and was leaving now as someone whose story had finally, carefully begun to be told. Not to the government, not to a chart, to her. She figured that counted as its own kind of mission accomplished. She drove home the long way that evening, windows down, the mountains going purple as the light faded, already counting the days until the drive to Roanoke. 3 months passed before Sabrina finally sat on a visitor's bench at the rehabilitation center in Roanoke without being on duty anywhere. No badge, no chart, just her and a free Saturday and a route she already knew by heart. She found Daniel in the courtyard, alone, practicing transfers between his chair and a low bench, his whole body straining with the effort of a movement that 6 months earlier he wouldn't have had to think about twice. A physical therapist watched a few feet away, jotting something on a clipboard, but Daniel didn't notice her arrival until she was almost beside the bench. "You're early," he said out of breath, but smiling in a way that still looked new on him, like a piece of clothing he was learning how to wear. "I promised decent coffee. Decent coffee doesn't wait." He laughed, shifted his weight onto his arms, and finished the transfer with a control that hadn't been there the last time she'd watched him try it. Watching him, sweating, out of breath, entirely present, she realized that the man from room 4, the one who catalogued exits and never turned his back on a door, the one who barked orders in his sleep at people who weren't there anymore to hear them, hadn't disappeared. He'd just finally stopped fighting alone. "How's it going here?" she asked, sitting down beside him. "Hard," he said, with an honesty that would have been unthinkable months ago, but a different hard than before. "This one, I can see the end of." She thought about saying something about mountains, about summits, some easy metaphor that would fit the moment. Instead, she just rested her hand on his shoulder, the way she'd learned to do without him pulling away, and said the only thing that actually mattered. "I brought the coffee, and I'm staying the whole afternoon." That was enough. It always had been.